Hello, my name is Kira Martin, Event Director with CCW Europe, and I'm joined here this afternoon by Tim Shepheard-Walwyn, who serves as a Senior Manager with Sprint Reply UK. As a key partner of CCW and an industry thought leader, we are delighted to be speaking with Tim today to hear his advice and insights on the future of the contact centre. So, Tim, thank you so much for joining us. How are you firstly?
I'm great, thank you. I'm really excited to be here and share as much insight as I can with you.
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear it. So this is set to be quite a period of growth as we move into this new world of customer contact. So I'm interested to hear firstly, what do you see as the biggest area of untapped potential in contact centres right now?
Yeah, I mean, if I can, I'm going to give you a couple, I think, just because they're quite sort of symbiotic with each other. So the first thing I think is untapped to a point is thinking about self-service. So for me, that is very much key, where, you know, how do we deflect conversations, if you like, from our contact centers, but deflect them well and not just sort of make your customers feel like you don't want to talk to them. So self-service really needs to be part of that strategy of giving a viable alternative for customers to actually fulfill something. You know, if I've just got a common query, give them an answer, or if they want to make a change to a booking or something on their account, give them the ability to do that in a really nice, seamless way. So you achieve a couple of benefits with that. You're going to make the customer hopefully a lot happier because they've got that instant outcome or gratification off the back of that. And from a load perspective, if you like, you're becoming more efficient in your operation because you don't necessarily have to take calls from customers who could otherwise and would otherwise be quite happy to fulfill some of those things themselves. So this is where technology such as chatbots becomes very powerful, as not just a deflection mechanism, but equally for some of those intense or queries that customers have, really offering that alternative to fulfill something end to end. The second point from a potential is thinking about the customer insight a little bit more and really sort of coming back to what are we trying to get out of this? Are we just trying to not talk to our customers or sort of actually give them the tools that they need to achieve an outcome themselves? Or actually, do we want to sort of go back a few steps further? And an example of that is typically we only analyze the calls that we get. What about the calls that we nearly got and didn't? And just to sort of expand on that point a little bit, because I appreciate where it comes across a bit strange, is you might have a customer who is interested in store opening hours, for example. And I would argue that's quite a low bar of they're not really going to sit on a queue and call you and ask you about that. However, they might give up when trying to find that information on your website, for example. So it's a little bit of an edge case, but if we just sort of pull the thread on this one a little bit, if we start to think about deflection, if we start to think about technology like chatbots, we can actually give customers assistance for almost these minor queries, if you like, that they might otherwise give up on, but aren't important enough for them to warrant a phone call. So actually what we're getting off this is increased customer satisfaction because it's a more well-rounded opportunity for them to get the information that they're looking for, and also some really interesting insight that we can start to analyze as well of here's the contact drivers where we did speak to somebody, and here's the other areas where we assisted somebody, which wouldn't have necessarily led to an inbound phone call, if that makes sense. So it's really about benefiting customers at source through automation, and also accepting the fact that actually these are opportunities to understand what our customers are looking for. It doesn't always have to be looking backwards from existing phone calls, because I think there's a little bit of low-hanging fruit or untapped insight there.
Absolutely. I'm really glad that you mentioned that example too, Tim, because many of our listeners are either entering or on their chatbot journey at the moment. So what is your advice for getting the most out of self-service?
Yeah, it's one of those things where there's a lot of moving parts, and I appreciate the challenges of where do we start. I think building on that previous point is too many solutions and approaches. I think they really only sort of focus on optimizing the agent experience, and you can argue by the time we get to that point, we've already got the problem. We've got high load or high volume sometimes. We've got a customer who's potentially had to wait to speak with you, and I think the sort of the key sort of advice there is don't just look at those contact drivers, actually trace those back to source to understand why your customers are getting in touch. And if they are getting in touch, quite often they need to. It might be something that you feel that actually you need that human contact, or it's something a little bit more complex. But I think always sort of have that, that sort of stress test, if you like, of saying, why can I not offer some automation for this as an option for customers? Because we also have to accept that some people like the human touch and they'll insist on that. We always have to make sure that's provisioned. But equally, a lot of customers would be perfectly happy to self-serve. And again, coming back from why we're speaking to the agent, can we start to expand that self-service side of things and ultimately make things a little bit more sort of efficient off the back of that? The other sort of point I wanted to add really is a lot of this is only visible once you've taken that plunge and we've got that real world telemetry coming through. Because if we start with a baseline of here is everything that we know, because we're trying to augment phone calls, for example, you really need to actually launch something like a chatbot with that in mind, inspired by what we feel our customers are going to want to talk to us about. But then sort of have that opportunity to get that real world data, the telemetry, get the conversations and get that further insight. I think just to sort of balance and say, yes, people who communicate on this particular channel are asking the same sorts of things, referring to those earlier examples, or are they looking for different things off the back of that? And I think a lot of this really comes down to that why of it removes any automation that we do, removes that noise from our agents. Can we, reduce the volume and sort of enable, the experiences, if you like, of our agents and improve the experience of our customers to focus on those more complex edge cases. So it's not a case of we don't want to talk to people, it's a does this need a person? And where it does, let's do it well, because we've got more time on our hands from deflecting where we could.
Sure, that's fantastic advice. And if you don't mind, I'd quite like to talk a little bit about business stabilization, Tim, because business stabilization and capacity modeling has become a real key priority for our listeners right now. With costs rising and resources really stretched due to COVID, where do you think contact centers should be focusing their business improvement efforts right now?
I think, building on the previous advice of how do we reduce the volume into our contact centers is it's a priority for many, because when we start to, as you mentioned, look at capacity modeling and how do we almost do more with less, I think you could also argue the point of, do we do more with the same? And what I mean by that is using your optimizations well. So if we have any sort of reduction in terms of load because we've introduced technologies such as chatbots, what does that automation return, get it reinvested in for your business? And I think a lot of this is also looking at from a pandemic perspective. What are the new habits from employees and the sort of customer expectations as well? People need that personal touch again. They want, in a competitive world, they want to feel, feel the support, if you like, coming back. From an employee perspective, many areas are struggling to, recruit and retain. So how do we make, their lives a little bit more interesting from not just having to deal with mundane queries as well, and focusing on more sort of complex edge cases and things like that. So I think if we start to say, if we have a reduction in volume, we should actually start to think about, this isn't about reducing agent counts. This is actually on reducing call queue times for your existing customers, with your existing capacity to improve that overall experience. This is really about taking those gains and actually putting them back into the business to try and sort of increase benefits and other sorts of areas as well. The other sort of thing to think about from a cost perspective and resources being stretched is when we come back to the contact drivers and analysing those and starting to think about self-service, is really trying to sort of focus on that a little bit as well. So with other sort of technologies such as the robotic process automation side of things, just to name one, how do we make that experience more efficient where we can actually fulfill things between different systems? Or if we find that we've got other bottlenecks for the agents where they have to run through a whole bunch of completion tasks and update multiple systems. So it's not all about reducing that call or doing something, it's how do we continue that journey, but reinvest and sort of almost self-fund that journey to a point from some of that low-hanging fruit, from reducing that initial demand for things that we could signpost or give automated responses to.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Again, brilliant advice. I'm wondering if we can jump back slightly to something you mentioned earlier, which is cutting through the noise. I think when making calculated business investments, for our listeners, it can be very difficult to cut through the noise and just choose a toolbox of technology that will really deliver impact. So, Tim, what was your advice on investing in digital over the coming months and year?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I think one challenge that we see is there's always something that's an incumbent system. And for many customers, it's something that they've invested heavily in, or there's a wider sort of program of work, and it's not always feasible to try and disrupt that. So my focus and advice really is always thinking about not replacing what you've got necessarily, and how do we start to augment and add value to what you've got, and just fill in the cracks really, I think is a much more sensible approach, because we can hit the ground running, you can get that return on investment sooner. It doesn't have to be as disruptive, because I think too many solutions can promise numerous improvements only when you make those large strategic changes from those existing platforms. And it's a much tougher sell, because a lot of these benefits are very iterative. We need to launch early, we need to get that real-time telemetry from engaging with people, things like chatbots. And there's a process that you go through for that, and a big bang doesn't really achieve that. There's too much risk on the status quo and existing systems that people use. I think occasionally that's going to be required, but it's definitely coming back to that point of always first look to enhance what you have, and then present things like customer chatbots and in isolation of existing platforms, because there's very few situations where it's actually a necessity for these things to link up. There's lots of benefits where you do, but you can actually start to get those incremental gains early to then justify and give the confidence to start to expand that footprint a little bit. I think a secondary point on that last point I made was, think about live chat. So if we have that, and let's say you've got an existing telephony platform, we're used to taking phone calls from customers. If we implemented a chatbot, we could actually have a separate live chat platform. It doesn't necessarily need to be part of the core. These can be just another tab that agents are using and sort of interfacing with. So I think it's starting small, it's augmenting what you've got. And don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of benefit, and we certainly do this sometimes as well, where there is a much bigger footprint that you start to bring into it. Mm-hmm. But I would argue that's only when it's proven itself, and you can prove things by dipping your toes in without disrupting the status quo.
Wonderful. Again, brilliant advice. So, Tim, thank you so much for sharing some of your time and insights with us today. It was a pleasure to have you join us. We, of course, look forward to continue to partnering with you, and look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Look forward to it.
Thanks, Tim. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.